Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, the podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to services to entire businesses. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to talk about the future of education, learning theory, user experience, and how the right tools and psychology we might be able to blend online and in-person education in the most perfect way in the future. Good morning, Dee. How's the week treating you?
It's going pretty good. It's been a busy week. It's hard to believe that it's not even close to the end of the week yet, unfortunately.
Yeah. Have you got vaccinated yet? Anything good like that happening?
I have not. My partner has gotten her first dose, which makes me very happy because she's a frontline worker with some health vulnerabilities. So, and my mom also got vaccinated. So, the people that I'm worried about are starting to get vaccinated. It's making me a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah, it takes the pressure off, and also pressure is with a lot of parents being at home with kids that are doing online education right now. So I think this is a really good topic to have for today because we're kind of in the middle of this, hopefully tapering off of the pandemic, and maybe the kids will go back in the fall. But like most parents, we have been managing remote education since this happened, and it's been a real eye-opening experience for me. And I see a big opportunity there for remote learning, but also areas that can use improvement. Like I feel like the teachers have been amazing. Our school district has been amazing. But when you look at all the different tools that are being used, we're having to kind of stitch them together, right? Because you have some for math, some for organization, some for science, and the kids are learning all the different applications and everything. So I think that there's a opportunity here, a kind of a user experience opportunity to kind of
Mhm.
seamlessly pull all that stuff together, and we could have something pretty amazing in the future.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that whatever results people are getting out of remote learning right now, it's obviously not optimized. Was a situation that wasn't foreseen, it wasn't planned, it wasn't designed for. It was something that we all had to react to the world pushing us in a certain direction. So people started using tools like Zoom in order to teach classes, and that's not really what it was designed for. It's not really designed to have conversations with 20 to 30 people at one time. It was more for small business meetings, 5, 6, 7 people. Every now and then you might have to set it up for broadcasting. But then you have other tools like, Twitch or YouTube where you can live stream, but it's not really set up for them to talk back to you. So like none of these tools are really being used in the way that were designed to be used. They're being pressed into service. And that's one thing to keep in mind is over the next 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to see dramatic improvements in remote learning, virtual classrooms, and just curriculum in general that is going to really make remote learning one of the tools in the toolbox for anybody who's going to be going through some education.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we experienced it as well. So the kids use Google Classroom in our district, which is really good. It helps you organize all your to-dos and your calendars and everything. And what it does, it actually brings you into the Google ecosystem fully. So when we first started, it was just like, oh my gosh, everyone's got to go online. So it was part Google Classroom, part Zoom. And then the district said, no, we're going to use Google's video feature connected to Google Classroom for security reasons instead of using two different applications. So they strung those two applications together and said, okay, now everything's packaged in one place. And then they had to go find third-party services for things like math and that kind of stuff. Because our son's in a Montessori school, and a Montessori
Mhm.
school is traditionally very hands-on. They use like math manipulatives and all those types of things. And so now you're going basically from a hands-on interactive experience to a non-interactive experience. And then as it started to progress, they started doing pickups of materials, and they started providing those materials for you to pick up from the school and bring home and then use them during your online classes. So you're already seeing what you're talking about, which is that kind of blending of online discussions and kind of testing and that kind of stuff with the physical stuff like the math manipulatives and science experiments and things like that. It's just he's not in the classroom yet,
Yeah.
right? And so like I can imagine if you blended them together, like you're saying, where you're going to have some in person, and then some at home, but you have like all these tools really dialed in, it could create a pretty amazing experience, actually. Like I see it in a positive
Yeah.
view.
Well, if you think about, traditional homework like we used to do, where you had your worksheets or your reading or your printouts that you had to like write on with pen, pencil, and so forth,
Yep.
and you replace that entirely with multimedia interactive experience for learning, that will be a tremendous improvement on what we used to do. And I also look at how some of the gaming experiences out there are somewhat educational. Like you can get into like Minecraft and get into the redstone things and learn quite a bit about logic and about circuitry and electrical engineering because it's all designed to mimic that. And there's plenty of other educational gaming experiences out there too that are not just like the boring old educational games we used to think about, but are more that are
Yeah.
actually entertaining for kids. And we know from just psychology and our training in how the brain works and how people learn that if you can process information in a way that is more connected to your pre-existing knowledge or your understanding of the world, you're going to remember it much better. It's called levels of processing theory, and it's been very effective, I think, for anybody who's tailoring an education, any kind of curriculum to them to fit into what they already know. And it's one of the reasons why adjusting education as we go through the generations so that it is relatable to them makes it more memorable and understandable, and they'll just understand it at a deeper level.
Yeah, on that point, I'm not sure if you had the chance to experience this, but Lego has moved their original Lego manuals to become apps now. And
Hmm.
so you bring up the app and then it takes you step by step on how to build the Legos. But it does something else that is like really amazing. You can actually zoom in on the Lego pieces, take your finger and move them around. So you know how we do 3D models for hardware development, like when we're going to do like a 3D print? It basically has that model in there. So if you're confused, you can just take your fingers and turn it and you can look at the model from the bottom to the side, everything. I'm already starting to see a little bit of that get injected into some of these applications that my son is using in like small ways. Imagine if you enhance that, right? Because where it gets challenging is the visual component of learning, right? So we know through psychology, and you and I have given talks on this stuff about storytelling, is that when you tell a full story and it has visual components and it has the ability to like touch it, manipulate it, things like that, for some reason that we know based on learning theory, it actually cements into your brain more, right? And
Absolutely.
so just kind of staring at a teacher on a screen and listening the whole time, that's challenging because there's only a subset of students that can handle that. When I
Hmm.
saw what Lego was doing with their education and how my son was able to take the phone and twist it around and see where the Lego pieces go and basically go from doing a Lego set that was 8 and up to 12 and up by himself simply because he was able to take a few moments and look at the model.
Hmm.
Right there, perfect example of an amazing tool that can be applied to home education.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's tons of stuff out there. There are things even outside of the educational realm that I think have been instructive. Like you look at any teenager who's playing any kind of game, especially like let's say a strategy game like Civilization or an MMO like World of Warcraft. They're online and they're learning about that game, right? Or Call of Duty even. They're learning new strategies, how to play. They're learning kind of the mechanics of it and the educational resources that they're providing through YouTube, through Twitch, and through these other sources are kind of instructive for how online curriculum can really work when it comes to other mediums.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was just thinking back about um, our NASA days and how a lot of the research was around how do we do the same tasks but in different ways. Like, for example, do you always have to use your hand to move something? Is it possible to turn your head and then the object moves with you, or to use sound to locate where an object is located? And I started thinking about some of the complaints that parents were having. And
Hmm.
one of the complaints is eye strain and being on the screen all day long. And I think in the future, what we're going to find is that people are going to take that data and they're going to look at it and say, I think we can develop online tools that actually implement audio only or
Yeah.
video only without audio in order to like manage the flow of strain. So, for example, maybe when you're listening to a story, it's showing the interactive story on there, but maybe when you're rewinding that story in order to listen to detail, you can click a button, it shuts the screen off. You're no longer staring at the screen. You're just using your ears in order to try to compute or understand what is actually happening, right? Like playing with those modalities, the way that we did at NASA, I think could yield some pretty interesting results. And you already see this with gaming, right? Like definitely there are times when we can like mute Minecraft because we don't need to really hear what's going on. We just need to visually see what's going on, right? So why do I have to use all of my senses in that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it varies by topic area, obviously, right? Like you don't necessarily need a ton of visuals in order to process history, because history can be organized into stories, and you can learn quite a bit through like a podcast format, especially an interactive podcast format, where there could be a dramatization of some historical event like Washington and Valley Forge, right? You can have some kind of like a narrative depiction of what's going on. You can have actors and then a narrator explaining what's happening and everything that occurred, and tell that story of Valley Forge in a way that anybody can process a little bit easier, because humans just process stories and narrative a little bit easier. And then you wrap that back into going back to a screen at some point and kind of processing through some exercises, and you have kind of a much more filled out experience rather than just reading it in a book or watching some kind of infographic on a screen.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about your experience when you were in high school. Which classes do you think you absorbed the most amount of information in?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think I had a variety of interests. I think I absorbed a lot of information in the science classes, which makes a lot of sense because we went on to get science degrees.
Uh huh.
Lab classes were interesting, but I don't feel like I got a ton from them. Like I'm tend to be, obviously there's differences between individuals. I
Hmm.
tend to attach to theories, right? So logical theory structures of how things work. So in physics, it was less seeing, or physiology was another one, right? It was less seeing, okay, here's an explanation for how this theory actually functioning, and it was more diving into, all right, here are the different elements of theory and how they kind of stack together. I kind of look at theory like Legos, right? You have the different pieces and they're interesting in themselves. You start putting them together and you're seeing how they interact with each other, and it becomes very interesting. So, like in physics, for example, you might have the effect of gravity, then you have the effect like wind resistance, and then you have some other factors that come involved, and together they create a phenomenon that can be predictable, like where something falling will land. Those are all really interesting components to me.
Yeah, but you've told me like multiple times that like it's much multiple times, probably thousands of times since I've known you, right? That for you, consuming information seems to be at a much higher volume when you're reading it yourself
Yeah.
or you're kind of digging through it rather than listening, right? So like a lot of those classes you're talking about, those are complex topics. So like when you think back at those classes, did your and I know that you consumed a lot of it and actually still remember a lot of it. Do you feel like it was because you were listening to the teacher explain it in a compelling way, like a story driven way? Or do you feel like you just went home and read the book or read the materials and that's how your brain was able to consume it?
What I can tell you now about how I consume information is that I prefer to read it because I can control the pacing a lot more. And I tend to think, I guess, very critically about any piece of information that comes across me. And you know this, whenever you're telling me, oh, hey, this thing came along, and I'm like, is that really true? Like, let's look into that. I want to dig into this detail of this thing and find out, like, to what extent is it true? What are the factors that might be mediating that's true? Why did that happen? Before I move on to the next thing. And if I'm just listening to somebody talk, they're going to say something and I'm going to want to dig into that something that they just said, but they're already on to something else. So I'm like, all right, wait, pause. Let me dig into that. And I can do that much easier when I'm reading. If I'm reading like a news article or something and somebody's saying, like, this office got shut down, then my interest is like, oh, is this just happening in San Francisco? Or is this happening somewhere else? And I want to kind of stop and look into that before I continue with that article. And it's so much easier to do it when I'm reading.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When I think about the kind of modalities of learning and education, I always go back to this one class that I had in college, and it like blew my mind. It was a history class, and the teacher came in, and it was interesting. She taught in corporate America, so there were people that had jobs in different tech companies around the Bay Area who wanted to get their master's degree, but they didn't have the time to basically drive to the university. So the companies would hire them to come in and teach in one of their rooms after work. So you just walk downstairs and then you take courses, right? It was kind of a cool concept. And so I don't know if she kind of learned this because she was dealing with mostly like adults that don't have limited amount of time. But she came in and she said, okay, here's the deal. This is a history class. I'm going to give you dates and times and all these types of things, and you're not going to remember any of them. So all we're going to do is you're going to sit here and you're going to relax, and I'm going to tell you a story. And she started from the beginning of that class, and she told the most compelling history stories until the end of the class. Then at the end of the class, she said, I want you to write down the details that you remember from the story, just things to kind of help you recall it in the future. And next week, we'll talk about this thing that happened in history. And then at the end of each, like month or whatever it is or segment, she would do a quiz. And the quiz wasn't like, in 1872, so and so did this or that. She said, tell me what happened during the gold rush. Tell me what happened and write as much as you possibly can. And everyone just sat there and wrote stories. And it was phenomenal. Like, I feel like the history that I actually know came from that class, and everything else I have to look up.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that is one of the reasons why I retain so much information, and people have told me over and over again that my memory is really effective, is that I look for this interconnectivity of information, right? And I think that's one of the things that a narrative gets to. And we know, like we mentioned before, levels of processing theory, if you can connect some form of information to your existing information and see how that interconnectivity works and how those things integrate, you're get much more likely to remember it, and you're going to understand it at a deeper level. When I think that information is presented through a narrative, that naturally happens because we relate to stories because it's presented in a way that highlights human experience. If you're watching a movie, let's say you're watching Zootopia, right? It's a great movie. One of the elements about Zootopia is that they make the stories relatable. You remember some aspect of that story that is relative or similar to something that you've experienced in your own life, or is similar to a story of someone that you know, or something like that. And that establishes that interconnectivity, right? That relatability of storytelling, that inherent element of storytelling, that it's relatable. It makes the information process at a deeper level psychologically. And it's one of the reasons
Mm-hmm.
why narrative is such a powerful way of learning new things and processing information.
Yeah, I mean, the question always comes up. Everyone always says this. They go, why do I remember all the details of a movie that I saw, but I can't remember the details of the things that we talked about in class last week?
Yeah.
Right. This constantly comes up. And I really do think a big part of that is the narrative storytelling and the way in which it's like strung together and everything. But, as people say that, and over time I said, yeah, I agree with you. I also started thinking, when you watch a movie, you don't watch it for 8 hours a day. You
No,
watch it like one moment, right, for a couple hours, right? When you're doing remote learning for school, you're kind of on the screen basically all day long, right? So there's probably a fatigue portion there that happens where you're like, okay, I'm on this. And then by 10 a.m., you're like, I'm off this.
yeah, well, I think that that's one of the reasons why I think it happens a little bit less when you're in grade school, like K through 8 or so. When you get into high school, things start getting broken up by topic a bit more, right? Like where you're getting into specific topic areas. But I think people need time to process the information as it comes in. If you just stay head down the entire time, then nothing really has a chance to sink in, which is why a lot of times the old method of just constantly memorizing information is not that useful or not that effective.
Yeah.
It's worthwhile to take a look at mathematics. And one of the reasons why math and some other more technical information can be less accessible to people And it's because it is, I mean, mathematics is ultimately a symbolic representation of logic, right? It's not, people think of it as the way that the world works, but it's not really the world works. It's the way that our human brains can describe the world works using symbology. But by doing so, it kind of loses a narrative element to it and makes it unrelatable. So it's hard to look at just a math equation, and especially when you get into more complex math and relate that to human experience because it's intentionally abstracted, right? It's intended to be like this can describe any individual situation. And a lot of times people learn math without understanding the application of the math. Like you can learn calculus to calculate the area of a curve without understanding that this is going to be used in order to engineer a bridge, right? So as it loses that connection with the real world by becoming more abstracted, it's more inaccessible. And the same thing happens with like computer programming, where you start learning or other very technical stuff where it's intended to be very flexible and fit into a variety of situations. But by doing so, it loses a little bit of the narrative thread and becomes less relatable and a little bit less accessible. I think the people who do well in those fields are people who find ways to relate it to their experience.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When you're thinking about this online versus in-person education, you have to bridge the gap between only studying theory and actually practically applying it, because that's how the brain puts all the pieces, the puzzle pieces together. So I remember when I was doing, I volunteered to be part of the search and rescue team at NASA, and we were there I did it for like 3 years and stuff. It was very cool, very good experience. And I remember there was a lot of book learning early on where you're like going through the book and you're figuring out, okay, here's how I tie this up if I'm on a bridge and I have to lower myself down in the water to help someone or whatever it is, right? And then once we got to the practical aspect of it and you're standing up on this really, really high bridge, the thought runs through your mind, okay, I know how to tie this, but now I'm like, okay, is this thing going to hold? What happens if this piece of metal breaks off? How strong is the bolt that's holding the metal? What if there's an abrasion on my rope, right? You go right from I understand why we're doing this, how we're doing this, and how it should be done to I don't know that I computed all these pieces just
Mhm.
yet, right? And the only way to really figure that out and feel confident about it is to do it and have experiences. And then once you weave those together, then you can start to tell a bigger story in your brain about like how you're doing it, how to be safe, how to be effective at it. And I notice with especially with my son and the online education is that thankfully our school district is on top of things big time, and they're applying those practical aspects at the home. And I know it's hard on them because they have to have delivery of materials and all this kind of stuff, and they're making it work. But without it, it would have just been all theory.
Yeah. And everybody knows this if they've ever done anything complex is when you do it the first time, like say you're cooking and you're cooking something for the first time, your attention will go to the things that are much more fundamental, like the bigger rocks within the puzzle, right? And as you do it over and over again, those things become more automatic and you can focus on other things. So like in the rock climbing example, your you might the first few times you might be very focused on your ropes or your lines and your harness and the different paraphernalia and making sure that they're set up the right way. But over time, as that becomes more automatic, then you can focus on the finer details. You can identify, okay, well, there's some fraying on this rope, or this anchor isn't quite in right. Or you start noticing different things, and we know that if you take somebody with a lot of expertise, and if you take somebody who is just a normal person, you have them watch a football game, right? And then you ask them questions about what happened in the game, they're not going to remember a ton. They're going to remember kind of the overarching narrative of the game of like, okay, well, first our heroes were doing okay, and then at the beginning of the second half, they fell behind and they had to come back and they executed, they did all these things. But if you ask an NFL quarterback about that game, they'll be able to break down every single offensive play, what was called, what play was done, if it was a run play, if it was a pass play, what kind of routes they were taking. And they're all doing this from memory because they have all this knowledge built up behind it. So they just process all that information at a different level. And that's one of the things that has to be taken in mind when you're developing curriculum is how you progress from the basics to the more complex. And if you establish the basics correctly, then the more complex becomes much more easy.
Yeah, and I can speak to that for a second. I don't know if I ever told you this, but I took online computer programming in 1998. It was a 100% online course only
I'm
in
sure all
98.
of yeah, I'm sure all of that you learned in 98 is very useful today.
It's absolutely not useful at all. But it was really interesting because everyone keeps talking about how like all these new tools for online education. I was like, God, man, I was doing it in '98, right? And it worked. For me, it didn't work as well as like it should because like when it comes to coding and things like that, like I kind of need someone sitting there like in the lab where I could say like I don't get this, it's failing, like how do I fix this, that kind of stuff. Like it's one of those for me it's more hands on. But what I will say was the fact that it like told you what you needed to do and you had to like learn these modules and then they had these sample exercises back in the late 90s. I mean, that's ridiculous that here we are today and we're still talking about this stuff when we never really worked it out. But like honestly, I think the real winner of this whole entire online education thing is going to be Google because every single person I talked to, every parent said their kid is on Google Classroom. And the amount of data that Google is acquiring from how they log in, when they log in, how often they are in a class, how often things are uploaded, how they upload their homework, the speed at which they can upload their, I mean, I think we're going to see a massive amount of development on Google Classroom in the next 5 years.
Yeah, and we know that Google they've been investing in the classroom for quite some time. We know that Google Classroom's been around for quite some time. They've been donating Chromebooks to classrooms for quite some time. All the Google Doc stuff are set up so that it's easy for students to get into and learn and use. And I think that
Mhm.
children who use Google in the classroom end up being adults who use Classroom in the universities and in the office. So I think that is
Agreed.
going to pay off for Google for sure. And everything that they're learning now about how people learn and how that learning kind of progresses into activity and adulthood is going to continue to improve the work that they do. And ultimately, one of the things that I think needs to happen is we need some kind of experienced pioneer who can take what's happening in the classroom and find a way to translate it into what can happen virtually. Because you can't just take, somebody's lecture that they're doing in front of a classroom and just pop it into a YouTube video and then expect people to learn everything, right? It has to be adapted to the medium, and that's one of the reasons why it's experienced some challenges over the past year. Is that teachers are taking the same model from the classroom in which they're in person, they're talking directly to people, they're in front of people, they can use their presence and their position in the classroom in order to make points or to communicate with people or to create impressions for people. And now you're all doing it remotely. You're trying to engage with 20, 30 kids potentially in a class, and it's not the same. You have to kind of rethink the medium and the approach. And I've seen some great videos out there who do it. Like I've sent you before, like girlfriend
Hmm.
reviews. I think has really kind of produced videos that are highly informative and entertaining, and they use a lot of pop cultural references and memes and things in order to do it. But they do a great job sometimes of teaching. They're video game focused, right? So they're teaching sometimes some video game history or even some elements of like story theory and how storytelling gets told, and why some of these stories in certain games are so compelling versus others which are less so. And I think there's plenty of other YouTubers out there and other content creators who are applying these concepts in a way that are bringing younger people in and providing a lot of information. We've brought up the kind of content creators before, but I think the more that the educators in our world can learn from those people's mastery of the medium, the better they're going to be able to adapt
Hmm.
the curriculum going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's going to happen quite quickly. And I think that having this first big pandemic and knowing that, hey, it's inevitable that we'll probably have another pandemic in the future, we need to be prepared. I think as they start to adapt to that, and also overcrowding of colleges and universities and things like that, right? You can kind of let out some of that pressure by doing part remote, part in person. I was talking about those videos though. I watched the ones that you sent over. They were really good because there's storytelling, there's humor, there's like all kinds of stuff injected in it, and then I remember it, right? And I wrote
Yeah.
a list of a couple ones that I really liked. So drunk history, that one's actually
Yeah.
pretty good. It's really funny, so you kind of remember historically what happened. Another one that was really done really well in partnership with, I believe, Khan Academy was Imagineering in a Box. And the reason why that one was good from Disney was they were basically teaching you what it's like to be an Imagineer. So they're kind of inspiring kids to want to come and have that job. But they would do things like first they would tell you, then they would show you, then they would actually show you the outcome of what had happened after you're done doing it. Then they would have online tools where you can actually try doing it yourself. And in addition to that, you start with a project in the very beginning, and that project continues through the entire process of all the videos. So by the time you're done, you've actually completed something and you have that feelings of accomplishment. And I think when you weave all this stuff together like that and you do
Mhm.
really good storytelling like that, what it does, it also lifts everybody up and it starts to make you more confident about certifications and things like that are starting to emerge, online education certifications, right? Where you could say, I'm an employer and Demetrius has this certification in some type of software development or whatever it is. And I trust because I've gone through this program myself and I realize how immersive it is and all that kind of good stuff, that the output of it is going to be great. And I'll hire
Yeah.
that person because I trust that they know something, right?
Yeah.
And so I
And
think it all ties together.
yeah, and that actually makes me think of Trailhead, which we've had the chance to work on a little bit through our partnerships with Salesforce. But
Yeah.
I feel like one of the things they do a great job of creating a technical foundation for people who might not be the most technical. Because one of the most difficult things with anything technical is what's the entry point? How can I get the basics? You can't just really go to a Wikipedia page and read it because there's so much jargon. There's so many underlying principles and concepts that you don't have the right foundation in order to process it. But by going, Trailhead does a great job of starting you with some providing curated education, so you could start from the basics, learn that foundation, and progress through. I would recommend anybody who's interested in blockchain and for cryptocurrencies, like we talked about, I think last week or the week before, go to Trailhead, take their blockchain basics module. It actually does a great job of explaining in very accessible way, like what blockchain is, what it does, kind of what are the roles of cryptocurrencies going forward. And I think that something like that provides a model for how people can teach some of the more complex and technical aspects of or the more technical topics when it's a little bit harder to get into a narrative because they're so abstract.
They do all those quizzes on there, and what's really cool is they're all positive focused. So it's not like, you got a bunch of these wrong. It's like, hey, great job. You got 3 out of 5. Let's take a look at the 2 that you didn't get and try again. It's like they're promoting you to want to go back and kind of learn from your own mistakes and everything. They do a nice job.
Yeah, they also have a lot of applied learning, so you can go from learning some concepts to actually applying them. And if you're learning some kind of database setups or anything like that, then you can go through and actually create those data models.
What do you think about some of these more innovative tools that are coming out for remote education, such as stuff from Coursera and Khan Academy and all these different places to supplement the education that, for example, kids and all of us basically are getting from our traditional forms of education?
Well, I think everything's still in flux right now. Everybody's figuring out what's the best approach and most effective approach. And I think it's going to be different by topic. I think it's going to be different by age group. And it's going to ultimately need some level of tailoring for that individual, right? Some people are much more into a visual form of learning. Some people are more into other forms of learning, more tactile or auditory, and that can also vary by topic area. I know for me that I'm can be much more tactile on certain topics than I am on others, and that can vary. Like if I'm doing something very technical, if I'm doing something that's very focused on on learning a new skill like computer programming or electrical engineering or something like that, that it's much easier for
Hmm.
me to both learn the principles and the theories behind it while I am doing, like, okay, well, here is how voltage will react as it's spread across circuits, to, at the same time, to be kind of like working in a virtual or real circuit at the same time. That's a little bit different when you get into
Yeah.
history or literature, where it's actually sometimes to the detriment to break you out of that story in order to elaborate on a detail. Like if you're learning Shakespeare, you don't want to get halfway through Hamlet's soliloquy and stop and do a literary analysis, right? That's it's kind of inappropriate, and you're also you're not able to do a full literary analysis because you're not all the way through it. Same thing with like Crime and Punishment, right? If you get like only a third of the way through Crime and Punishment, and then you do a literary analysis, then the message of the book is very different than if you finish the whole thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it just depends. Like you mentioned about being a visual learner and stuff. I mean, kind of goes back to learning theory, right? Learning theory is all about like receiving, processing, and sustaining knowledge, right? And different people learn in different ways. You have the visual learners, auditory learners, and then kinesthetic learners, right? The people who are like remembering the emotional connections and feelings from stories. If you can kind of blend all those things together, I think that's where you get an amazing educational tool. And I think that these companies, the ones that are going to surface to the top as being the leaders in this space in the future, being the ones that focus on psychology. They're the ones that are going to have psychologists and others injected into the process and helping them understand how people learn. Former teachers, former like anyone who's in that space who has basically observed from a distance or been directly interacting with kids and others on learning and figuring out all the little components that help develop mastery and stuff. And with that said, I'd like to ask, like, what are your predictions for the next 5 to 10 years? Like, what do you think it's going to look like now that we're kind of, hopefully, fingers crossed, slowly coming out of the pandemic and into a little bit more normal lifestyle?
I think they're going to find a way to integrate what is happening remotely and what is happening in the classroom. I think that we're going to see potentially maybe a little bit less classroom time for older children, especially getting into high school. You think about what goes into classroom time, right? You have a certain amount of time once you're going through a lecture, and then you have like your head down work on your assignment time. I think a lot of that doesn't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
need to happen in the classroom, and to some extent, I think it might be beneficial for it to happen asynchronously outside of the classroom. So I think you might see shorter classroom times, more study hall, and more remote learning. And I think that homework is where we're going to see some of the biggest impacts, where homework will now, it's already progressed to some extent for sure, right? But it's going to be a lot more like an interactive YouTube video or a stream than it has been, than what it was previously. And you're going to see integration of gamification and some other aspects in order to make it more
Mm-hmm.
compelling and also to get kids to process it at a deeper level. One of the most interesting things that I think will happen, or it could happen, I can't say that it will happen, is if they will get some of these influencers involved. Like if they're going to get PewDiePie
Mm-hmm.
and Dream and some of these big influencers to participate in education in order to keep people engaged, because they can do this remotely. You couldn't have, when we were kids, you couldn't have Fresh Prince, Will Smith come to our classroom and teach us, right? But now that you have the remote, you can have PewDiePie log in or previously record something that's specific to learning this one thing about history or current events or whatever it is, and distribute that virtually to everybody to help keep people engaged.
That's true. We see it a little bit happening right now, but you're right. Maybe there'll be a lot of that. I mean, it'd be very cool. Like if you're learning blockchain, suddenly you click the video and the authority in the world on blockchain pops in and says, okay, let me explain what's happening as of like today on this stuff, right? Like there's so many ways you can weave that into the education system and make people feel like they're right on top of everything, on the cusp of technology, on the cusp of what we're learning from society. I mean, even the pandemic is a kind of anecdotally, the fact that we're actually sharing non-peer reviewed published data like
Yeah.
on the web in real time now. I mean, that was something we would have never done 10 years ago, 5 years ago, right? And now we're like, hey, this article is indicating it's going in this direction. We haven't finished the data analysis, but it looks positive, right? Like it just doesn't happen. And now people are saying, like, I kind of like that. I like having up to date information, even if it does have to shift or change a little bit, because I want to know what's happening in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the classroom could be, all right, well, we've got some kind of international incident going on. You might actually be able to get a short video of the Secretary of State putting out
Mm-hmm.
a message directly to school children in our country with infographics backing it up. You know, even if it's just a 2, 3 minute video or something, it can still have a huge impact and help people feel like they're connected with what's happening and connecting with the decision makers that are out there and understand at least kind of what that person feels like a little bit. What's their communication style? What's their approach? And then you can also leverage other
Yeah.
people's strengths, right? Like you mentioned drunk history. You can take even old drunk history episodes and re-edit them to include some interactivity or to touch on some key points or to exclude other key points and then use that in a history class. Or one of the guys I really enjoy is produces a YouTube series called Thug Notes. He apparently is a teacher in the community. You get that sense from watching his videos, but he's very like, if he reminds me of like old school hip hop, like your like Run DMC or something like that. And he's wearing the gold chains and stuff, but he's doing breakdowns of literature like Macbeth or Great Gatsby or To Kill a Mockingbird and all these kinds of stories in a way that anybody who is into hip hop, whether regardless of their background, is going to connect with the language that he uses and just the way that he presents it. You know, some things that can be very period, right? Like reading Nathaniel Hawthorne can be a challenge these days because we just don't use that language anymore. So you take somebody who has very
Mm-hmm.
accessible language, and I think it can help kids who see that as being not for them now processing it, and for him to say this is amazing because blah blah blah, and to use it in a way that's very relatable, can really help kids to engage with some of these stories from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think that's actually a great place to wrap up the podcast. I think what we should do is circle back after the kids go back to school, like
Yeah.
sometime after September, and let's see if we can figure out what's going on, like how it changed, whether or not this stuff gets implemented more permanently, like the remote education, and go from there. So, everyone, thank you so much for listening to this podcast today. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Please tell a friend, and we will see you all next week.